Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk speaking. Now, first of all, thank you so very much for listening to the podcast. Now, I am very excited to let you know that the podcast is now available on Amazon Alexa. You know the drill. Simply say, Alexa, play Public Relations Review Podcast, and she'll take it from there. And again, thank you for listening. And if you enjoy the program, please become a subscriber. Now, on to the podcast.
Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review Podcast, a program to discuss the many facets of public relations with seasoned professionals, educators, authors, and others. Now, here is your host, Peter Woolfolk.
Welcome to the Public Relations Review Podcast and to our listeners across America and around the world. Now, our data shows that we now have listeners in over 40 countries, and we are carried on 22 podcasting host sites. Thank you so very much for your support. My guest today is head of Dakota Strategic Communications. The firm has provided services to clients in a wide range of areas. Briefly, here some of them are: fundraising, event planning, unmanned aerial systems, technology camps, drones, economic development, business relationship curator, policy advisor, legislative agent, oil and gas producers, wind and alternative energy, just to name a few. Now, on top of that, he also hosts the Morning Lowdown show on radio station KTGO. So let me welcome my guest today, Dennis Lindahl, joining us today from Stanley, North Dakota. Welcome, Dennis, to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to some other public relations professionals. Thank you.
You know, I ran off a list of different areas that you provided public relations services to. How did you prepare yourself or gain the preparation to be able to service clients in such a wide area of activities?
Wow. So my experience started in advertising with just selling and servicing car dealerships for a local newspaper. And so that was a very intensive education, being an account executive and managing 16 different car lots. And I'm sure, car dealers are very tough customers. And so I felt like I got put through a ringer very early. I did that while I was in college. And then throughout the years, I got an opportunity to just work at a very small firm on a temporary issue in Columbus, Ohio. And so I went there on a three-week temporary assignment, and I ended up being there for 3 years. And so that was the Craig Group, and they managed a lot of the communications for Philip Morris, General Motors, Anheuser-Busch St. Louis. And so, being there was very intense. And the founder of that, Phil Craig, he recently passed away, but he had very good connections there in Ohio, Retail Merchants Association, just a lot of good, solid connections. And, I worked my way through the firm. I was there for 3 weeks. I was there for a 3-week temporary assignment, and I actually ended up being there for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And so throughout that, I became a lobbyist and worked on a lot of different issues, worked on campaigns, attended Governor Ted Strickland's inauguration ball, and got very close to the mayor of Columbus, Ohio. And it was just a great experience. Worked with a wide variety of clients, including local liquor issues, and that led me to work with a lot of the Islamic community that owned a lot of the grocery stores that were trying to preserve their liquor licenses. And so I became a lobbyist for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collection agent, and things got a little bit soft in the economy, and I told my wife, I said, maybe it's time to go back home to North Dakota. And boy, we certainly are glad that we did, because, we had no idea that the financial, correction was going to happen, the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009. And then we got here and got involved in an oil boom. So we hit the ground right at the right time, and we just celebrated Dakota Strategic Communications 10-year anniversary last July. So we've been in business a while and excited to service those companies.
Now, as you went through your process and maturation, as you said, before you moved back to North Dakota, did you find out that once you learned the process of producing information for whatever the area was, that process remained the same? It was just a matter of now I have to learn about the particular industry or the particular client and weave them into that process. How did that work for you?
Well, yes, and that was a very intense education as well. My mentor, Mr. Phil Craig, he did association management, and so I believe we had 14 or 15 associations. And so, any time that telephone rang, you had to get to three rings or you lose the game. And having to know about every single one of those telephone lines, when that person on the other end of that phone is asking a question about that particular client or about that particular issue, I mean, you got to know. You can't second guess. And so we would have, we'd have our Monday morning meetings, and we'd talk about what all the clients are doing, and we'd have to be able to pick up that phone. And being able to pick up that phone is really, I have a little skill on the telephone, a little bit, and enough to, know, to communicate concisely and clearly. And that led to all kinds of opportunities. But being able to focus in on the client, what the client needs, and people that call and ask questions about that particular client, being Johnny on the spot, that's really how, that's kind of like the crucible for me, in trying to develop a level of professionalism. And then that just led to the other opportunities. Is there an opportunity to manage a campaign? Is there an opportunity to, do a walk and talk? Is there an opportunity to do a lit drop? Is there an opportunity to do a letter writing campaign? And so all of that, acquiring that knowledge to work with all the different clients, that eventually led me to start my own firm. So that was that you can't get much more of a swing state than Ohio, where, a lot of times before I got this experience, it was a lot of my career experience was based on intuition. What is my intuition telling me? You listen to all these different sources and you try to draw on that intuition, but then actually working in the profession where, you got to run a phone bank, you got to do a letter drive, you got to do surveys. Sometimes they're in person, sometimes they're on the internet, sometimes they might be on social media, but being able to find out and quantify your intuition, like you kind of think you have this, but we really have to nail this down so we can report to the client, accurate information, quantifiable data, and then, that leads to successful campaigns. So that's really, where I got my, where I grew my teeth, I guess.
It's interesting because I was also in politics, and one of the things that I did learn there was because when you're dealing with the bills that pass in Congress or that they're working on in Congress, they're big, thick items, several hundred pages at a minimum. And one of the things that I found out very early on is that I just need to know the big ticket items, if you will. What is the thrust of this? Because there are a lot of other nuances built in. So as long as I knew the essentials of what it was they were going to be discussing, for the most part, that's what I would talk to the reporters about. But because we also have our legislative aides there, those are the people who help craft the bills, I recognize that I could now bring them in to talk about all the nuances and dig, and really get down into the weeds with reporters who needed to know that kind of information. And understanding that helped me apply at least that skill to working almost in any area that came in front of me.
Absolutely. Becoming so our firm really developed by becoming a reliable source. I put out my shingle, I put up my website, I registered with the Secretary of State, and, that business hung there probably for about a year until, I had an opportunity to service a client. And I totally agree with you, is that, so when I left Ohio, I thought I was done. I'm done being a lobbyist. I'm done. Politics is dirty. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I was just done. But I came back home to North Dakota, and just, that experience, when you dance with the devil doesn't change, you change. And so, me coming here, knowing what I know, and becoming a reliable source of information, that's what really grew the firm, because people call this firm and they know, okay, if there's anybody that knows what's going on or has an instinct what's going on, it's going to be Dennis. And so, becoming a reliable source for reporters, it's interesting because, a lot of people get public relations and advertising confused, but the people that need to know the difference are the journalist. Mm-hmm. And so having a journalist be able to call you and say, hey, what's going on in your territory? What are you hearing about this issue? And then that translates into being able to pick up the phone and call a reporter. And when you do a press release, they know it's reliable. And when your firm gets a reputation of being able to write press releases, and then that leads to stories, that really, mm-hmm. I believe, adds to not just the reputation of the firm, but adds to the value of the firm and what you can deliver to the clients.
It's interesting, as I listen to you talk about your transition from Ohio to North Dakota, the same thing happened when I came from Washington, D.C. to here in Nashville, Tennessee. The scope of things that I dealt with in Washington was so much bigger. We're talking national. So I had to think on a different level, how to think bigger about issues, and also the details, because members of Congress, when you put together these pieces of legislation, there's a lot of bits and pieces that have to go into, because there's a lot of constituents involved. Well, coming here to Nashville, people didn't think on a larger scale as I had been used to, because obviously, they didn't have to. But when clients recognized that you had the ability to think on a larger scale and include more things in making their project much better than had been in the past, that began to accelerate, as you pointed out, accelerate your reputation, and exploded, because now people say, hey, wait a minute, this person is a lot better than we've had in the past. Let's continue with them. So those experiences certainly benefited, it appears, both you and I in growing in our craft.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we do in our firm is I always encourage short-term contracts. So, a lot of times when you deal with an advertising agency or when you deal with a public relations firm, they want to sign a year contract. They say, okay, I'm going to represent you for a year. But, you really haven't had a chance to meet the client, and you really haven't had a chance to meet the representative, your lobbyist or your PR professional. And so I always encourage 6-month contracts. And people say, well, why would you do a 6-month contract? Every other contract I've ever signed with public relations or a publicist, that's a year contract. And I say, because that puts me under pressure. That keeps me under pressure to keep you pleased. And there have been numerous times mm-hmm. when my 6-month contract rolls into a year. I've had clients for 4 years. I've had clients where eventually I just stop billing them because we're not doing any work. They'll call me and they say, hey, what happened on this issue? And I'll tell them, and they say, oh, we haven't seen an invoice in a while. We say, well, we haven't been doing any work for you, so we stopped invoicing. Mm-hmm. And so it just gets to be where, a lot of times when people are looking for a professional to represent them, they say you got to care about the issue. I necessarily don't believe that every, I used to have an idea that, I had to believe in every issue that every client brought me. And so, sometimes you are confronted with an issue and you don't agree with that, so you turn down that client. But I've now come to understand and believe that if you care about the constituents, so if a company comes to me, like say one of the companies we've represented in the past is Humane Society of the United States of America. Well, that's a little bit of a tough sell in an agricultural area. And so I did. I took them as a client. I said, yes, but let's have a two-way conversation. And so we actually led them through legislation that came. North Dakota became, I believe it was the 49th state in the union to get animal cruelty laws. It was a very tough sell, but we were with them. Kind of people look at the firm like, oh, well, you represented, Humane Society of the United States of America. And then my response would be, but look at how we represented them.
Mm-hmm.
We kept them out of the pitfalls so that their goal and that their legislation could pass, which it did. That was the goal, was to get animal cruelty laws on the books, which is what we did. And so caring about the constituents, who are my constituents? My constituents are, farm, ag, oil producers, royalty owners. And so I feel like if you care about the constituents, if you care about the community, if you care about the people that are going to receive the message, I think that you end up being a much better public relations professional.
I think that's a very, very interesting piece there, because as you said, it appears that there are two opposing groups here. How did you navigate, if you're representing the Humane Society, how did you navigate that, or at least begin to, let's say, maybe the cattle ranchers or chicken farmers, or how did you navigate that through them so that they could see that this is not as bad as it sounds?
Well, so I may have, we just say I'm a clod kicker from Western North Dakota. I'm just a North Dakota kid. I'm one generation removed from the farm, but I love communications. I love the way people communicate. I love how people talk to each other. I love how people email. I love the social media. I want to get into the nuts and bolts of how people communicate, what they say, their vernacular, the terms they use. And so wanting to understand that, wanting to kind of try to take that apart, I believe with all of my heart that success, at least 80% of success is just showing up. So when they have a meeting, when they're having a meeting about animal cruelty, I got to be there. Mm-hmm. I can't call it in. I got to show up. I got to put on my boots. I got to drive down there, which is, almost a 3-hour drive to the legislative session. If I got to get a hotel, if I got to get, my accommodations, I have to show up. And every time they meet, you better be there. If you're not there, you're not representing your client. If you're sending, I've seen this a lot of times, they'll send an intern. They'll send, what I might refer to as an underling. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. When you got a hard issue, when you've got something that really is important, you have got to show up. And if you show up, this is what I believe. I believe if you show up and you show up in person, and it's going to be a little bit hard with this COVID-19, but if you show up in person, people like to do business with people that they know. Mm-hmm. And if you let them know who you are, and you let them know what your background is and what your experience is and why are you representing this client? Why would a kid from Western North Dakota whose family is horse ranchers, why would they support the Humane Society of the United States of America? Well, because my family, we care about animals. Mm-hmm. We're not just out here just, exploiting the animals or exploiting the land. We care about the land. We care about the animals. And so then once you become that person that's standing in that spot, and once they see that you care enough, and you care enough to make testimony, and you care enough to go to the socials, and you care enough to meet with the legislators individual, once they see that you care enough, then they'll listen. Mm-hmm. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. Mm-hmm. And so you have to demonstrate to them that you care. Do you care about the issue? It's not just, we're just not out here collecting checks from clients. We are representing them.
Well, I think you made two important points, and that is, one, developing relationships, because once people see you and understand who you are and what you're standing for, that certainly helps. But one of the things in terms of why when I started my firm, that I said I'm going to have experienced people, because one of the shortcomings sometimes of the larger firms is that, yes, in fact, they did send in interns to oversee this particular client. And interns just don't know enough. They don't have the background. They don't have the skills and know-how to really service in and all of the problems that a client could potentially have. And that in itself winds up being a downfall for the larger companies, because, the heavy hitters aren't there to actually solve the problems.
Well, I love interns. We use interns. I was ensconced at, interns can do a lot of heavy lifting. But what is the phrase? I even think it's a Bible verse. No man can serve two masters. So a lot of times these interns, they're in school, they're in their post-secondary education, they're moving towards their degree, and so that's their main focus and that's their goal, and that's fine because they can do a lot of heavy lifting, phone calls, surveys, walk and talks. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that an entry-level person can accomplish. But when it comes to where what I would say where the rubber meets the road, I mean, you got to have the person that wears the shoes and knows, what to say. Because, I mean, I hate to say it, but, sometimes in public relations, it can get to be dog eat dog, which that's a little bit of the reason why I left Ohio, is because it was so dog eat dog. But I saw a lot of people make mistakes. I saw, listen, and you, especially in this Me Too movement now, let's talk about something really serious, is that you've probably seen it too. In public relations and advertising, a lot of these executives, they see an intern, and I hate to say it, but prior to the Me Too movement, these guys they'd salivate. They say, oh, here's somebody that I could take advantage of, or for whatever reason I can exploit them. And sometimes you just can't send that person into the lion's den. You cannot send an entry level person into the lion's den. You got to be there and you got to know, okay, this is how these guys operate. This is what they say. This is how they talk. Sometimes their language could get coarse, especially when we're talking about politicians. Hopefully, as we push through this Me Too movement, hopefully that's come to an end. I hope and pray that it has. But, that's been the situation where, you're running interference and you say you go to a conference and you may take some young people with you, take some interns with you. I mean, you got your hands full running interference for these poor people, trying to protect them from things that they don't know.
Well, as I said before, I worked on Capitol Hill before the Me Too movement, and I can tell you there was a lot of that sort of activity going on. Pardon me, in terms of congressmen and they weren't interns; they were just young employees, because a lot of congressional staff are kids right out of college. So they're there to try to learn. But the other problem is that they're not going to put up a lot of resistance. They're going to do what they're told to do. And so, you're right. They can show up, they can take notes and so forth. But you've got to be careful, because some of those guys up there were not doing the right thing. They knew they weren't doing the right thing, but at the time, nobody really brought the hammer down on them. But thank goodness
there was no accountability. There was no accountability. Yeah, I totally agreed. And but that's the same situation even when you're talking about a walk and talk. So if you're in a neighborhood where there's a heated issue and you need to get information on the ground, you're going to do a lit drop, you're going to do a walk and talk, you're going to try to do a grassroots movement. If you send inexperienced people in, say, for example, I worked on a campaign where there was a rezoning for a Walmart, and it was in Ohio, a very unionized town. They did not like the Walmart, and also it was on the political boundary of a very wealthy neighborhood. So we had interns, we had people doing the walk and talks, doing the lit drops, and getting confronted, being aggressive. And at some point, I had to make a command decision, which was to pull all the interns because it was just too dangerous. People were getting confronted, they were getting yelled at, and you just have to say, hey, look, I'm the 42-year-old guy and I'm doing the walk and talk. And so, being a more mature person doing a campaign, you're probably much less likely to get confronted by a union person that opposes the Walmart than you might be, if you were, an 18 or 19-year-old, young person. And so you just have to say, what did I say? 80% of success is showing up. And if you got to pick up the clipboard and you got to walk door to door, that's what you got to do if you want to win the issue for your client.
One of the other things I learned was because we've done something similar. One of the towns down the road here wanted to put in a light rail system, and it ran through certain neighborhoods. One of the things I've learned is, let me find who is the loudest opponent, who is opposing this, making the most noise. I want to sit down with that person, but I don't want to do it publicly. I don't want to get into a shouting match. Let's go have some coffee and tell me exactly why you are opposed to this particular project. And, so we can talk, person to person. It also helps me understand what their argument is, and are the reasons that they're giving, are they legitimate reasons? So now that we've had this conversation, I understand what your problems are. Let me look into this and find out, is there anything we can do, or can we find some middle ground to work on? So now you've mitigated the loud noise. You've got the thing is on pause, and perhaps maybe there is some misinformation from both sides. Once we get that cleared up, now we can perhaps sit down at the table and negotiate some things in a more peaceful manner. But I always wanted to find out who was the loudest opponent and pull them aside at some point so we can have a discussion, and then we can really get things worked out.
Oh, no, that's a great point, because, a lot of times, if you look at somebody like as a political opponent, then you might not want to sit down with them. There may be some, hesitance, some reticence to communicate with them. So that's a very, very good point, is because, I've worked on issues issues that are so sensitive, I probably shouldn't even talk about them with you, but, issues where the opponents of my clients had unbelievably good points and unbelievable reasons for why they would oppose my client's objectives. And so you're absolutely right. Getting down to the nitty gritty of why, it's super important, because then that's all information that you can take back to the clients, so that they can, because ultimately I should hope so, a professional, sometimes people get so caught up in their titles, they may act like they are the professionals, but really it's always the client that has to be calling the shots. And if the clients don't have enough information, then they can't make the right decision to tell you how to execute their goal.
I agree with you. So let me just suggest now in the closing minutes here, because you had these wide experiences, and I know that as I've looked at the data, we do have a lot of younger listeners. And I'm not sure where they are in their public relations career, but let's say that they're beginning their public relations career. What advice would you give to them about getting as much information from many different sources, public relations sources, and areas that you possibly could? The benefits of that. So if no matter what, we work with a lot of young people, with our different drone projects. So we have a client that does a lot with unmanned aerial systems. And I'll tell every single one of those kids the same thing that I would tell anybody else, which is you have to make sure use your youth to screen what it is exactly that you want to do, because there is no experience that is wasted. So if people are really, really interested in communications, you got to be really, really passionate about it, because if you're not passionate about it, someone else will come along and be passionate about your client's issue. So you got to be passionate about it, and use the young time to figure out exactly what it is you want to do. I discovered that I love communications, and I found that the profession of public relations is well suited for what I already love to do. So I just want people that get involved in any vocation, just make sure that it is that you love what it is that you're doing, because if you don't love it, eventually it'll get to be a grind, and we don't ever want to do that, because when we get into a grind, then that's when we lose our opportunity. We lose our profit. We lose our shot at the gold ring, or the brass ring, so to speak. So we always want to be passionate about what we're doing, so we can always, advise those clients. Well, my guest today has been Dennis Lindahl. He is head of Dakota Strategic Communications. He's joined us today from Stanley, North Carolina. Stanley, North Dakota. And I want to thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we can do this again in the near future.
Absolutely. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you so much.
Okay, and to my listeners, thank you for joining, and don't forget to listen to the next edition of the Public Relations Review. Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies. an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, let me say thank you so much for being a listener. Now, I want to alert you to our shiny new podcast website located at podpage.com. However, you can go directly to the podcast site located at publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can contact me through email. You can leave a voice message. You can leave a review. You can read an episode blog and frequently learn about the podcast guests. You might also want to suggest podcast topic ideas or even suggest a guest. You can also let me know if you would like to receive our podcast listener logo that you can post on your social media. So I look forward to hearing from you about our new podcast website. Thank you so much for listening to the Public Relations Review Podcast, and have a great day.